Good morning and welcome. I'm Alex Vatanka, a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C., and I'm pleased to welcome you all to today's panel discussion. Today's topic is on the impact of the recent 12-day war between Iran and Israel. On July the 21st, the Middle East Institute hosted a panel, which you can still find on our website, on Israeli perspectives. Today, we'll look at Iranian perspectives on the war. How did Iranian society and the political order in that country react to this war? Has the impact of the war created new realities for the ruling elite? And how might the war impact Iran's relations with the outside world, not least, of course, the United States and Israel? MEI is delighted to welcome our three experts for a conversation around these questions. In the interest of time, I will introduce them by name affiliation only and in the order they will be speaking today. First, we have Siamak Namazi, a businessman and analyst who has deep insights into how the Iranian regime operates. Siamak was released in 2023 after spending 8 years as a hostage of the Islamic Republic. Next, we have Holly Dagres, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and is a widely published analyst focusing on trends in the Iranian society. Last but not least, we have Dr. Arash Azizi, a historian of Iran and presently a lecturer at Yale University. The title of his most recent book is What Iranians Want. I encourage everyone to submit your questions. Please use the Zoom's Q&A feature. I'll be looking at all of your questions and we'll include as many as possible into this panel discussion. But let me start off by asking each of our three speakers the same big picture question, which is, in your view, how would you assess the impact of this war a month after it ended and could resume at any moment? So let me start with Siamak, then turn to Holly, and then Arash, and we'll take it from there. Siamak, the floor is yours, and thanks for joining us, to all three of you.
Thank you for having me, Alex. It's a pleasure to be on this MEI panel. I have to confess, I'm not very used to Zoom sessions, and I kind of missed out on this COVID Zoom revolution. I was on sabbatical, let's say. You asked about the impact of the war and the regime, but it would be remiss of me as someone that was held hostage for 8 years not to start out by maybe acknowledging that one of the impacts is the increase in the taking of dual and foreign nationals, where the regime wants to use them as bargaining chips, and a plea to President Trump to do all that he can to bring them home. We do have Americans detained in Iran right now. So let's go to your question. On the impact of the regime, I know we'll be talking about the structure of the regime before as well, but I think to assess any impact, we have to have a base to see where we were and where we moved to. And I would say that that the Islamic Republic has been transformed rapidly over the past decade into a complete kleptocratic kakistocracy, meaning rule by those least qualified to rule. Mr. Khamenei had really filled every seat that he could with people who are yes men. He has an aversion of anyone criticizing him or speaking against his will. So, it was very clear that those in charge were appointed because of their kowtow to the supreme leader rather than any ability to rule. There's also Khamenei's style, which was the creation of multiple parallel institutions, from everything from the military to ICT policy. Anything in Iran has all these parallel institutions, all of which are led by kleptocrats, but the decision-making in general is rather locked and paralyzed because there's always another institution to trip the other one as it goes. We had moved away from a regime that thought about its own survival into a system where you can kind of think of it as a mafia system with Khamenei on top and these underbosses. They were only thinking about the interests of their own group, not the regime as a whole, which led us to the situation that we've seen. And the level of kleptocracy, I mean, I always knew that Iran the Islamic Republic is a corrupt regime, but it was my 8 years in prison and being with some of these kleptocrats that the numbers really were astounding. I mean, they're beyond belief. As a fun anecdote, I remember, Iranian TV shows Western and American films, but a cut version of them. So it was showing the Italian job dubbed in Farsi. I was sitting in a room filled with some of these gentlemen. At the end of the movie, one of the guys, very genuinely, was scratching his head saying, I don't get it. So, well, it was kind of a simple plot. It was a bank job, a creative theft. He's saying, no, but the sum, what was that, like 11, $15 million, something like that? I said, yes. He said, and there were all these guys, so they're getting what, $1, $2 million each? He was saying, I wouldn't get out of bed for that. And he meant it. So he didn't get like, how could you make a Hollywood movie over people struggling so much to get that sum of money? That the numbers were astronomical. The point is that this regime was already on an unsustainable path towards disaster. And the war, and then followed by natural disasters, a drought causing severe water shortages and electricity shortages, has it in the whole country is in probably the most precarious position it's been in centuries, let alone in post-revolution. Then let's look at the people, where they were. I think in general, we know that the population is largely against the Islamic Republic. We don't have any real polling to have accurate numbers to rely on, but we can it's safe to say between 70 and 80% of the population is anti-regime. And there was kind of this, as I said, an emotional short circuit when the Israeli strikes first started, because people see the Islamic Republic almost as an invading force. It's a force that doesn't allow them their basic rights, it denies the basic rights, imprisons them, beats women on the street simply for their dress, anything else. So initially, there was almost a glee of seeing one invading force attacking the other, because they saw these IRGC generals getting blown up in their 8,000 square foot penthouses in northern Tehran. So there was that. But Iranians are also very patriotic. And I think very soon people started seeing the effect that this is not just surgical strikes on bedrooms of kleptocrats. It's a whole building going down. They understood their neighbors being affected. Then we had really things like the bombing of Tahrir Square, and people started seeing that. Obviously, the reprehensible attack on Evin prison, which I never understood why in the world Israel would bomb a bunch of prisoners in their cells. So people realize that the war is not just going to be contained to one invading force hitting at a regime that they hate, and that it's going to affect the entire country. I think the regime sees what happened next as people rallying around it, around the flag. But that's a mistake. People started helping each other. They rallied to help each other, not to. I don't think they got any closer to the regime. That hatred remains. In terms of civil society, the civil society and what we see on X and social media is not representative at all. It's several voices being amplified much louder than what they represent. The voices of civil society that I talk about are people that I spent years with in prison, people who are willing to go out in the street, who could mobilize others, and they will go to the street and for their values, and they will spend years in prison and pay the price. When I talk to this kind of people, their voice is very clear: no to war, no to the Islamic Republic. Their reaction beyond that is is a little more nuanced, and we can get into that later if you want. But they believe that the regime may not be able to defend Iranian borders and skies or even itself, but it's sure the hell is strong enough to machine gun them down if they come to the street. They're very, very, very cognizant of that. So to cut this short a bit, the bottom line is we have a lot of scenarios in front of us, but we have to remember we're dealing with a regime that is not very capable at all to deal with normal problems, let alone such a mammoth of problems put together. Its general strategy, I think, is going to hold. The Iranians believe, we say in Farsi, azin sutun be'on sutun farajiz, which means, just buy a little time and maybe there'll be salvation in it. It's muddled through. And I don't think that that's going to be good enough at all. I think there are many, many scenarios ahead of us, but the early signs is that the regime is headed towards some sort of what we're going to see as Saddam 1991, where he was in charge of the country and of the repression, but couldn't control his skies borders.
Well, thank you, Siamak. That was very rich, and I'll love to come back to you. I mean, one of the things you said in my follow-up question in the next round, what I hear you talk about the deep rivalries and incompetence and what that means for the sort of post-war realities of Iran, and we can link that to your familiarity with the players in the Islamic Republic as the way you got to see him firsthand when you were in Evin for those 8 years. Ollie, turning to you, and I know you have some slides you wanted to share, but I'd love to hear your take on the sort of big picture assessment in terms of looking at Iranian society, how it reacted during the war, and now in the weeks since the war, and what stood out for you.
Well, first, thank you for having me on this timely panel. I think some of my remarks are going to be highlighted based off of what Siamak also said, but just with more visuals. So bear with me as I open this slideshow. So yeah, right now, I mean, I was just looking at the calendar date, and I realized it's been a little over a month now since the ceasefire ended. But when you talk to most Iranians these days, even though it's been a month since that ceasefire, there's still uncertainty. A lot of Iranians think that the ceasefire won't hold. And it's in the back of their minds, in their day-to-day lives. They've obviously continued to live their lives during the war as much as they could, but in the aftermath, of course, as well. Just talking about the mood, I saw three key things. I saw anger and frustration and hope, and I'll unpack that a bit. So one of the big things I saw was anger directed at the clerical establishment itself. Siamak very well described it as being seen, the Islamic Republic being seen as an occupying force by anti-regime Iranians. But also in recent years, I would say since the December 2017, January 2018 protests onwards, which were at the time the largest in terms of geography since 1979, we've really seen this anger and resentment directed towards the clerical establishment for an array of reasons. And one of them, of course, was its foreign policy. We popularly heard chants like "Na Gaza, na Lebanon, Janemu Fado Iran," no to Gaza, no to Lebanon, our lives for Iran, because many were frustrated that the money of that should be spent on the Iranian people were being spent elsewhere. And so between its propping up of proxies in the region and its focus on the nuclear program, a lot of Iranians were thinking to themselves, well, your foreign policy decisions have brought this war upon us. And of course, there was the lack thereof air raid sirens and shelters that were really upsetting for many Iranians. But that anger about the war itself has actually, to an extent, turned onto ordinary things now. Right now, there's an acute water crisis and energy shortage in the country. There's been historically high temperatures throughout the country. And there's protests actually over the past week in places like Gilan province and Razavi Khorasan province and other cities and towns. And they're taking to the streets and they're chanting, incompetent officials, we don't want you. Water, electricity, life are fundamental rights. And today, actually, they announced that in 13 provinces, public offices were going to be shut down. And so I think Dr. Ali Ansari from St. Andrews, he had a really good quote when he was talking about the aftermath of the war. He said, when the dust settles and people start to ask questions, they will see that there's still no water, still no gas, still no electricity. And that's where we're at right now, is that that anger that was focused on the war is being turned back on the regime itself. There was also, during the war, interestingly, there was anger at the US and Israel by some anti-regime Iranians because, or not just anti-regime Iranians, but in general, because of the evacuation calls. And we all famously remember that President Donald Trump tweeted, immediately evacuate Tehran, which I have a screenshot of it in the slideshow. Iranians are like, evacuate where? There's 10 million of us. And then it didn't help the IDF Persian language spokesperson was posting pictures, and I have one below, of District 3, where state medias and a lot of popular embassies and Park Melat, if some of you are familiar with, is housed. And they were talking about evacuating these districts in Tehran at 2 in the morning when there were internet shutdowns. So there was a lot of anger about that directed at Israel and the United States. But there was also anger at them for not finishing the job and not taking out political leadership. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to like unpack some of the images I'm showing here to all of you. Our Siamak talked about the high rises. So actually, these are the pictures of the high rises and the penthouses. And one of the popular tweets that went around during the first, I would say, 24 or 48 hours of the war was this picture compilation of these penthouses, and it said those who were saying resist were all living in penthouses. And so a lot of Iranians were focusing on the double standards of the regime elites and the divisions within the people themselves. I've been talking a lot about the anti-regime sentiment, but I also want to hone in a bit about the pro-regime crowd. So during the war, there were actually more calls for the regime to actually develop a nuclear weapon. And a lot of the argument from the pro-regime crowd was that, hey, if we had this nuclear weapon, there wouldn't have been a war to begin with. This would have been a deterrence measure. And so that was some of the sentiment we saw on the ground. And there were even some of these pro-regime protests, and people were making these comments to state media that were circulating at the time. But I think that big picture for most Iranians, this was also a big reality check, that no foreign power was going to save the Iranian people from the Islamic Republic, and that they were their own saviors. And this was popularly highlighted by dissident rapper Tumaj Salehi, who quoted his song Rat Hole or Surakh Mush, and he tweeted out, "You are your own savior." Which brings me to some of the pictures of Khamenei I have in the corner, bottom right-hand side. There was a lot of highlighting of the hypocrisy, again, as I've noted, of the regime. Khamenei was in hiding because there was fear of an assassination of him by Israel during the war. And so a lot of people honed in on social media on the fact that he was in hiding or in a rat hole, as Tumaj Salehi would refer. And the bottom right-hand poster during that time, there was actually a lot of there was a couple of these posters popping up in I'm not sure what city it was, but actually the poster says missing. An Islamic Republic leader has been missing for some time. Please, if you have any information about him, contact the Mossad and save the nation from his evil. So there was a bit of humor during the war, but it also highlighted this divide between the people and the regime itself. And so I'm going to talk about a little bit more about this sense of, I guess, hope. And I think this hope partly was sparked by the fall of Bashar al-Assad in December. I think a lot of Iranians were hopeless that Women Life's Freedom, the 2022 uprising, didn't succeed in its goal of positive change in the country. And so a lot of Iranians were feeling hopeless. And then Bashar al-Assad fell in December, and some Iranians started saying to themselves, well, maybe in our lifetime we'll see the Islamic Republic fall. And so when this war happened, there really was a sense of these guys' days are numbered. And I think that the security rot within the clerical establishment, their inability to protect the country, the airspace, the infiltration of the Mossad within the intelligence apparatus really exposed the regime's weakness and showed that it was actually a paper lion. And so there's really been a lot of thinking and conversations about this regime is on its way out. Of course, are we seeing the signs of that? Not yet. I actually wrote a piece for the Washington Institute about signs for regime collapse. We really haven't seen those big defections. I know we saw this talk of defections through a QR code that former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi had put out, but we haven't seen actual physical defections. And of course, there was a shortages of food. There was temporary shortages. Like if you'd go to a shop and they'd be like, hey, you need dairy, come back the next day. But there wasn't acute shortages of food at the time of the war. Unfortunately, uh, actually, I'm gonna pause for a second. I'm gonna talk a little bit more about the images. So, Siamak talks about this, like, I would say I would describe it by some as euphoria at the first 24 hours of the war, because there was this sense that they were just focusing on these surgical strikes on leadership. And there was this viral video of these young Iranians actually partying, I think, during the first couple days of the war. So I'll play for all of you to watch for a second. Oh. So the woman is saying they're firing missiles and we're dancing. And so there was this, amongst some Iranians, there was actually a celebratory mood. And actually during the war, there were at least 300 arrests just for people's social media posts. We're not exactly sure what they were, but one could presume that those social media reports were related to stuff that were somewhat welcoming the Israeli attacks on the security apparatus and military apparatus. Another popular meme was the one that you're seeing of Khamenei and IRGC Quds Force, Ismail Ghani, and it says قبل از پیروزی بعد از پیروزی. So before the victory and after the victory. And it was honing in on how basically these key leaders look like hell in the aftermath of the war. But and despite the sense of hope that some people are having, unfortunately, the regime is doubling down, not just in its rhetoric, but its repression of its people. There was a lot of commentary when the ceasefire happened that, well, great, now these guys are going to be taking revenge on us. And there was a popular tweet, and I have the screenshot, and it says, look at what the mullahs have brought upon us, that news of a ceasefire is scarier than war. So there was a lot of concerns about that, and that's actually playing out in real time. Of course, Siamak talked about the dual and foreign nationals that are now being taken hostage during and in the aftermath of the war. But there were also 2,000 arrests. We've seen at least 7 executions. There's about 40 plus on death row that they're very concerned about. And of course, there's been targeting of ethnic and religious minorities. Members of the Jewish community, the Baha'i faith have been targeted. But one of the stories that it is getting some attention, but is also part of this, is the mass deportations of Afghans in Iran. There were just at least 500,000 deported in June alone. And a lot of the regime is using the war as an excuse to deport these Afghans, saying, well, they're not loyal. They must have been the ones that the Mossad had paid to cause the havoc with during the war, and they're using this as a guise to deport these Afghans, and Afghan families are being torn apart. There's very heartbreaking stories about this. Some of these Afghans haven't been to Afghanistan since the Soviet invasion in the 1980s. And so for them, the Afghanistan of today is not familiar for them. And unfortunately, some of these Afghans are being met with racist attacks from Iranians as well, who also are othering them and denying them their income or denying them access to hospitals and whatnot. So it's been really bad for Afghans on the ground. And so I will leave my comments at that, and thank you.
Thanks much, Holly. That was great. We'll, I'm sure, come back to some of those points you raised. Arash, I'm going to turn to you. And I also wanted to hear your big picture kind of assessment. What stands out for you when you look at the course of that war, the so-called 12-day war? But one of the things that jumped at me, which I know all of us paid attention to during the war, is the level of hatred the Islamic Republic has created for itself in Iranian society. Whereas that video we just saw, at least segments of Iranian society were cheering for the Israeli attacks. Now, I'm not going to exaggerate and say anything in terms of how big of Iranian society, subscribe to that. But the fact is that the regime admits openly on Iranian TV that they've lost a good part of Iranian society. Siamak points to 70-80%. I think he's right. It's a significant percentage. So as you described to us what you sort of stood out for you, I was wondering if you have seen any indications that the regime is more willing to admit that they've lost their own people, and going forward, that's certainly not an option for a country that might face another round of conflict with Israel and the United States.
Thank you very much. 1 month isn't a lot, but a lot of us had to do a lot of analysis while the missiles were flying. And of course, so I think it's actually quite nice to now have a bit of a distance to say, okay, the 12-day war, it has thankfully, it really is a 12-day war. It didn't continue, at least for now. And a bit of a distance, dust settled. What I'm trying to talk about today, what are the political consequences? What did each side really learn? And outside, I'm a political guy. I have my own politics and political sort of choices always. But I like to think that um, I don't sort of cloud my analysis by my political preferences. So I think one of the problems the Iran space is a lot of us want something. So, we will always, we'll find all the facts that support, what we'd like to, and say that. And I'm hoping, what I'm hoping that we don't do that here. And I think what I loved about Siamak and Holly's talks as well is that they're very clear-eyed as to what is really happening. So I'm going to continue in that vein. What as we say in Persian, there's this great saying, right? Chan chandim, right? Like what's the score, right? After this. The Iranian regime is absolutely widely hated. I think 70-80% is a very fair assumption, fair estimate. And it's not very hard to see why it's hated, by the way, right? This is a regime that has brought like crazy domestic repression. I'm not gonna list it, but just like very quick, crazy domestic repression, bad economic conditions. It really has given its people nothing. It's actually quite remarkable, right? The only situation in which you would be a supporter of the regime is that if you believe it to be some sort of a global fighter against Israel. But even in that account, actually, it's not clear that it's done very well. At the end of the day, it's not doing much of the fighting. And much of its establishment are corrupt or oligarchic, right? So even if you're a true devout believer, you will have problems with it from other angles. So that much we know. And I think that the war has only exacerbated that. It has one of the ways I think about the war is that it's been a catalyst. It's sort of really accelerated things that were already there. But what are some of those things? And let me point out something about yes, so some people were happy about the attacks in some ways. Many of us, of course, were not. But let's talk about the domestic political reactions. The fact of the matter is, significant sections who were previously part of the regime called they condemned the war, but they also called effectively for an end to the Islamic Republic. And this is a very important thing we have to remember. Now, of course, they didn't call it an end to the Islamic Republic. What the term that they used was there should be a referendum for a constitutional assembly to bring about a new order. I mean, that's obviously an end, right? If you want a constitutional assembly, that means you want to change of the regime. And this is Mustafa Tajzadeh, former acting interior minister, of course, Mir Hossein Mousavi, former prime minister, and hundreds of people who signed these letters. And I want to remind us, Tajzadeh in 2021 was the candidate of the Iranian Reformist Front. The Iranian Reformist Front, the same organization that nominated Pezeshkian in 2024, the current president, in 2021, its candidate was Mustafa Tajzadeh. So he's not some out of the system person. So the fact that people who were integral to the regime now call for an end to it is an interesting fact. And in fact, inside the reformist faction in Iran, there is a divide of those who basically criticize Tajzadeh and them, and they want a slow change, and they're called Rozan Gosha in Persian, and that those who are interested in more radical changes. But interestingly enough, actually, the faction that is on the leadership of the Iranian Reformist Front is more of the latter, i.e., they don't call for the radical changes, but they also don't agree with the guys who want a slower change. So not to get too distracted here. So let me sort of classify my thoughts a little. So what are the consequences of the war for different political factions in Iran? So first of all, for the regime, it was obviously sort of an embarrassment. The fact that they couldn't keep their own commanders safe. The fact that it was very clear that parts of the population, will not mind them, let's say, getting attacked at least. It was a moment of truth. It really shows the fact that they have to change the policies. I think, we have to not forget Ayatollah Khamenei has banked his past few years policy on the policy that he called no war, no negotiations. We won't negotiate, there won't be a war. And he said it, with such clear voice. And guess what? They negotiated and there was a war. It's really the worst of both worlds for Khamenei. Because at least if he hadn't negotiated, you'd say, okay, we're paying the price of, being obdurate. But he did negotiate, broke all those lines. His foreign minister wrote op-eds in Washington Post calling President Trump a president of peace, and yet Iran was attacked. So this is true. It's a big moment of crisis for them in this sense. But at the same time, in a way, it was also, they also won something. After all, this regime didn't collapse. After all, there were no mass protests. And I'll talk about, in the second part of my remarks, I'll talk about the Iranian opposition a little. After all, they were able to attack Israel. They were able to attack Israel, and there will always be a media war about how significant these attacks were. But, we all have, friends in Israel, people who we talked to during the war. This was not a walk in the park in Israel, right? It was a terrible time. At the very least, people had to spend, all of their day in shelter. Of course, many civilians were killed. Many civilians were affected. Important sites were affected. So the Islamic Republic, by no way it can hold its own against Israel, but it was able to also bring some damage. And we did not get to a failed state situation. Although I have to sort of put a caution in here that it wasn't far from it in some ways. Had Israel gone really after infrastructure a little bit more, we would have got to a failed state situation. And frankly, some days, even after the war, with the mass cuts in electricity and water, some days, you really think you might be in a failed state situation. But then sort of water comes back again and, see sort of things are not as bad as it could be. But so the regime does, so to sum up my assessment of what are the political consequences for the regime as a whole? The regime as a whole, I think they see the dead-end policies of Khamenei. They know that the post-Khamenei era has to come in some ways. They know you can't, this brinksmanship, this wanting to fight Israel and America all the time doesn't cut it. And I think a large section of the establishment has also sort of understood that. Even those who don't want political reform has just understood that this is not a path that is sustainable. And at the same time, I think they will take some measure of pride that they were able to keep the country together. After all, they were able to keep the country together, and they'll try, they'll try to sort of introduce themselves as and I think Holly has spoken about that, and maybe we'll speak about it more as well. They try to sort of put themselves in a nationalist color and say that they're the defenders of Iran, and we've seen obvious attempts for that. Now, so this is the regime as a whole. I would then say a couple of points about the opposition. But before that, I would say, we need to also really think about what does it mean? What do we mean when we're just speaking about the regime? I think this is a sort of very delicate point that is often lost. The the power making system, the power operations in Iran are very opaque, right? My favorite example of these power operations being opaque is I never forget, in 2015, a cabinet. This is really, I'm not exaggerating. A cabinet minister in Iran called me and said, "Who am I? I'm a little journalist in London." And said, "Someone's been arrested in Tehran. Um, can you sort of find out where he is?" I said, "You're a cabinet minister. Like, I have to find out for you where he is. Like, what's happening in this country when a cabinet minister of the Rouhani government doesn't know where someone is in jail, but they think, oh, maybe if you have some contact somewhere, you've heard something, you would know." So the power relations in Iran are opaque a little bit, right? It's not always clear. The term that, for example, is used in Iran a lot is haste sakht qudrat, the hardcore of the establishment. Sounds great, but it's not clear who is it. Is it actually like the six people around Khamenei? Is it a secret military committee in the IRGC? But what I would say is that there are many different factions with different goals, and they really are vying for power and for determining the shape of Iran post Khamenei, and they don't at all want the same thing. One of the frustrating things in sort of DC analysis for me is often that this is not talked about enough, or people think that if they admit to this, they'll say the regime is not so bad. No, it's as bad as anything. It's one of the worst cruel regimes that exist in the world, but it still has differences. And the people at the top of it, and this is my big, sort of thing that I like to say is that, they're not devout revolutionaries, unlike Ayatollah Khamenei. They're just not. And a lot of us have spoken to these people, know these people. They're not. There are many things, but they're not devout revolutionaries who wouldn't change their mind. Which means what? Which means they are sort of actors motivated by, by material interests and by seeking their future. So I'm coming to quite the end of my time here. So I'll say a couple of points about the Iranian opposition. So Iranian regime, as I said, sort of in crisis, is different factions fighting for the post-Khamenei era. What about the Iranian opposition? The fact of the matter is that there really is not much of an Iranian opposition. And I say this as a sort of paid-up, card-carrying member of the Iranian opposition, right? If by opposition we mean a political alternative that really seriously has a chance of vying for power in Tehran, it just doesn't exist at the moment. It's not rocket science. In order to have that, you need to have organizations, you need to have networks, and you just don't, right? The the two most organized forms of alternative that exist in Iranian opposition, one of it is MEK, the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran, which is not a serious alternative because it's so widely hated in Iran, as a lot of people know. And again, that's not a matter of opinion; it's a fact, and you don't need to take my word for it. I say to everybody because it's a contentious issue: go to any random group of Iran, go to University of Oklahoma, go to South Dakota, find any group of Iranians you want and ask them, what do you think about the MEK? You're not gonna find fans, right? Again, rocket science. Iranians are not gonna overthrow the Islamic Republic to give power to a Islamist, a Stalinist cult, right? It's just that's just how it is. The second alternative, which doesn't have anything close to that level of organization, is of course, Reza Pahlavi, who's organized some people around him. He had this conference in Munich. But first of all, there are 2 points about it. There's no serious level of organization. He might be able to get more of it at some point. But the second point, he's not widely hated like MEK. He's more polarizing. I would say he really does have some followers in Iran. Again, if this test of find any group of Iranians somewhere, there'll be some people, at least for the sole reason that they like the pre-1979 regime, right? And they're willing to give him a chance. But effectively, he is heading a very sort of noxious, polarizing not in a positive way, but one that is instead of trying to build unity, basically it's sort of a very chauvinistic and that try to drive everyone away. So, this makes it hard for them to try to sort of gain momentum as an alternative. They might gain momentum on certain op-ed pages somewhere or on Twitter, but amongst Iranians, it's very hard for them to appear as a sort of a sunny, real alternative to the regime. So as a result of that, I think and the war, of course, itself was a sort of moment of truth also for the opposition, because after all, Reza Pahlavi went on TV multiple times. He was rather supportive of the attacks, not sort of very directly always. Although his wife, for example, was directly supportive of the attacks at the beginning. And in politics, what your spouse does obviously matter as part of your political camp. But Pahlavi himself, effectively, I mean, he didn't condemn at all any of the civilian deaths in Iran. But he also repeatedly asked people to come out on the street, and of course, no one ever did. And of course, he's declared himself a transition leader. If you declare yourself transition of leader of something, you need to be able to do something every once in a while. Otherwise, he will be as much of a transition leader as Maryam Rajavi is the president-elect of Iran, as she's been since I was a kid, right? That's a long time ago, right? So my point is that Iranian opposition also finds itself in some sort of a strategic impasse. So yes, the regime is widely hated. And it's not, so I mentioned Pahlavi and others, all the rest of us, I mean, no organization, no clear alternative. A lot of people, myself included, signed this sort of petitions that calls for a referendum, constituent assembly in Iran. There are two different referendum going on, one headed by Mousavi and Tajzadeh, one headed by Narges Mohammadi, Nobel Peace Laureate, and others. But again, this does not make a sort of a organized sort of political alternative. So the question is, in this, and I'll end it here, sorry if I spoke too much, but in this sort of balance of different regime factions and different sort of, alternatives inside and outside Iran, I mean, when we think about the future of Iran and the future of the regime, we need to think about, who are not just power players, but, what are the different alternatives being proposed, right? And how do they hold water after this war? And I think it comes clear from what I try to say that neither the continuation regime as it is, but nor the sort of traditional, we'll get rid of the regime and we'll bring a democracy. Neither of them have done very well, basically. So there are sort of third ways that are more likely to come. So I'll end it here for now.
Thanks, Arash. That was wonderful. I'll come back to you. I think people would be interested, or audience members would be interested in this sort of you unpacking this issue of, you said post Khamenei scenarios, and he is 86 years old. He will eventually pass on. The question is, when listening to you, I was reminded of an interview I read by, I think his name is Ali Majidi, former ambassador of Iran to Japan and Germany. His basically main point was Iran should not wait to be devastated even more, should now go in a different direction. My question to you, coming back to you next round, is could you see this relaunch of Islamic Republic, or the beginning of, and then the big launch would happen once Khamenei passes on? Something I will come back to you. But Siamak, I'm going to turn to you now. Holly was talking about the millions of Afghans that live in Iran, and so many have been rounded up and sent back to Afghanistan on charges of supporting Israel. I haven't seen much credible evidence of how much of this is real. Certainly, I would have guessed that those leaders in the Islamic Republic whose whereabouts was given away wasn't the work of Afghan migrants. So my point is that this, again, to something that Arash also talked about, this sort of core of the regime that's corrupt, that's bankrupt, that is infiltrated, that's where the problem is. And some members of that core are people that you have interacted with in your 8 years in Evin prison. You've seen them, who they are as human beings, as members of this regime, whether they're genuine believers or opportunists, but you also seen the opposition in the same Evin prison. So I love it if you could sort of unpack that for us. What does that tell you, the nature of the regime and the nature of the opposition when it comes to the trajectory of this regime going forward following this war?
Well, first, I hadn't listened to Arash and Holly speak, and I enjoyed both of your comments. I found them very on the mark. In terms of what I saw about the regime, I used to talk to you have to understand, Evin prison, the guy, you meet people who until the day before was literally someone who could have meetings with the supreme leader, and then the next day he finds himself in a cell in utter disbelief. We have former ministers, I don't know, the number two of the judiciary, the sitting president's brother. It's an interesting place. And it's one of the prisons where you see the judge who, or the prosecutor who threw someone in prison and the prisoner in adjoining cells. So it's kind of a very dynamic place if you want to study the regime. One of the first things that I notice is, I think something that Arash also pointed out, even the regime doesn't understand the regime. It's become so complex. So I think all of us as Iran analysts have confronted someone in the Iranian establishment who says, the problem is you don't really understand the regime. I remember conversations with my interrogators and said, daring them, I said, actually, let's make bets. You don't either. And I took that bet because I'd done a study. Whenever things happen, like maximum pressure came, I would ask all these gentlemen in the ward, predict what's going to be the Islamic Republic's reaction. And I can say over the years, what I saw is 100% consistency of being wrong. They don't know. It's amazing how convoluted this system has become because of all the parallel systems. The other thing I've noticed about Iranian decision makers and policymakers, they don't work on scenarios. They say, we're going to do this, and the Americans will do that. I say, well, you control this part of the chessboard. Let the other guy decide how he wants to move his pieces. No, they're going to do that. It's all right. Let's assume he's crazy and he decides to do something else. They will not entertain another scenario. So they're very overconfident in general about where they go. I want to kind of go back to some of what Arash was also talking about. Let's look at the variety of responses the regime can have. You mentioned Mr. Tajzadeh. I have a lot of respect for him. I spent quite a bit of time in prison with him, and he's really one of a kind person. I think he initially was met with a lot of prisoners, political prisoners, saying, "Oh, you were part of the establishment. You're a reformist apologist." All the fun stuff that you can imagine. But I think he really won over everyone's respect because of his personality. But we have suggestions from him of this Constitutional Assembly essentially telling the Supreme Leader, you can't do this, resign, get out of the way, you are the problem. Then you have some people taking one step down and saying, well, that's not realistic. So maybe what we need to do is to push, and you see those things of why don't we suggest, and they have, to the Supreme Leader, okay, you have had this position that no war, no negotiations, opposition to the West, et cetera, you can't back down. Why don't you delegate power to some more moderate figures? And, moderate becomes relative. So people's names, you hear Larijani, who was former head of the National Security Council, maybe a council with him, with someone like former President Rouhani, and even one of the bigger thieves of that kleptocracy, Ghalibaf, coming together and kind of doing the dirty work that needs to be done as far as Khamenei would be concerned of making peace and nice with the West. So a charm offensive led by a different group to the West, and as well as a charm offensive with your own people. What does that look like? Free political prisoners. It looks like get Mr. Mousavi, the former prime minister, lift his house arrest. And they say, well, there's no price to be paid. You lifted the house arrest off of Karoubi, and absolutely nothing happened. So these are signals to make the people a little hopeful. They say, look, the rift between the regime and the people. I mean, there's one thing about disgruntled people. There's one thing about people even shouting death to Khamenei off the rooftops, which started a few years ago. I could even hear it in Evin prison. but when the Women Life Freedom movement started. But there's one thing about this patriotic population being gleeful when Israeli bombs drop. I mean, that to me even it's unfathomable that's what has happened. But that is the reality of how hated this regime is. So it's like, okay, we need to turn the volume down. So, and then you have a group of reformists who have even watered that down, that request of saying, hey, let's make a gesture to the Iranians abroad. Let's bring, just very empty nothingness. But what has been the regime's actual reaction? What has been Khamenei's? And this is still a regime, very much a top-heavy regime led by Khamenei. What was his reaction? Hadi and Arash both described it. It's a crackdown. Arrests, executions, etc., climbing. I think signals like putting in reappointing Ayatollah Jannati, the hardline cleric, who I think is, 1 3/4 of a foot in the grave. I mean, that guy's pushing 100. I mean, but he's a hardliner, and reappointing him is a signal of where Khamenei stands. So let's get into why in the world does, it's frustrating. You watch it and you say, why would you make such idiotic decisions? Why don't you even make any attempt to mend some of these rifts, even the simplest things? I think we have to put ourselves in Khamenei's position. Now, I've had some fun conversations with a lot of people who have met Khamenei, be it elite students. The elite students, I've heard this in different years from 3 different students who had taken part in iftars with the supreme leader. I mean, these are not, 1 or 10 students. This will be like thousands of students. And the supreme leader comes, sits down, basically takes a date or a piece. We have sugar cubes in Iran, and a sip of tea, puts it down, gets up and leaves. That's the entire meeting. What happens next is these elite students jump to get the date pit or half of the sugar cube and fought over it. I've heard exact same stories from elite businessmen who've met with him, with the difference that then they trade, and then they trade for that date pit or sugar cube. I'm just trying to tell you, put yourself in Khamenei's position. For 40 years or so, you have been treated like a god. I'm sure, at this point, he believes when he passes gas, it smells like ambrosia. I mean, this guy is delusional. He's old. And he is under extreme pressure, right? His top commanders just got wiped out. I mean, all of a sudden, all of them at once. He's in a rat hole, as Hadi so aptly described. But what has he concluded? I think he's concluded that he's been right all along. He made the mistake. He said, don't negotiate with the Americans. It's all a trap. And he thinks he's been proven right. So we're in a situation where we have a system that is not capable of dealing with these problems. It's not capable of moving. And I think it still feels it has some time. As I said, they are highlighting the fact that, well, the top commanders, and really kudos to them on this, that I can't think of too many military systems when you wipe out the top command and it still can launch attacks. It can still continue. Tehran and Iran, for all the problems that they have, is safe. This is not a regime that fell apart on its seams. And as I said, they see that they see the people's unity, people helping each other out as people rallying around the flag. And one of the concerns that I have is he going to think that maybe, just like Khomeini used to say, that the war with Iraq was a gift that God sent to help the regime survive? is he going to think that the continuation of the war, which is largely expected, I don't think anyone thinks that there won't be further Israeli strikes or the awful term mowing the lawn or whatever they call it, that won't continue. So I think we're in a very dangerous place. And civil society and the players that Arash aptly described know it, but they also are very limited in what they can do. I would say, if we look at Iraq, people really came out on the street when there were foreign soldiers, when they were safe. And I think it's very clear that that's not going to happen. So the civil society leaders that I talk to are extremely worried that that the aim of Israel is to turn Iran into some sort of Syria situation. They are very concerned about that kind of scenario. And they don't, what are their options? When we say people don't come out on the street because they've done this over the years and they know they just don't have the power to knock down the regime. And they see, Netanyahu, no one expects a Marshall Plan to come out of this. Netanyahu has brought us Gaza. This is right in front of the people. And they very much, when I talk to my former prison mates, they say, we live in this region. We've seen what war does. We've seen Libya. We've seen Syria. We've seen Iraq. We've seen all these countries. So they very much believe that they're going to be on their own. Let's keep looking down on the scenarios. People ask usually about what happens, what are the chances of an IRGC coup? Mm-hmm. That's beyond my ability to assess because I'm not, within the belly of that beast, but I was taken by the IRGC and, interrogations, often you learn a lot from them. And I was interrogated over 2 years and had handlers above and beyond that. The IRGC is also fragmented. One of the big shocks I had was when I learned my interrogators, which were from the Revolutionary Guard's intelligence services, absolutely hated General Qasem Soleimani. They hated him. They despised him. To the level that I would not be surprised that it was they who leaked where Soleimani was to get assassinated during Trump 1 administration. So we have to start thinking realistically who would instigate such a coup. Again, I'm taking wild guesses, but some of those people that were candidates were killed. Now, let's go back to, I would say someone like General Bagheri was probably the brightest bulb there. General Salami is, in Farsi, we would say, Shirin Mizane. He's not the sharpest tool in the shed. And he's very far from well, he's dead. Let's not talk behind his back, but he's definitely not the sharpest tool in the shed. So it's a matter of trying to even figure out that outcome. But, in a way, when I talk to people, that seems to even be like, okay, some sort of stability, something. They want Khamenei gone. But how? He's not going to step back. Now, Arash, you talked about the system saying, okay, these are not generally people who are ideologues. I agree. They're thieves, most of them. There's amazing, it's amazing how many of these people have, the intelligence services have dirt on every single Iranian politician that involves taking a bribe or lowering their pants when they shouldn't have. So they're and it's amazing. You see some of these guys who have fallen prey to a honey trap, and you look at them and say, but you were in that regime for like 40 years. You've seen your buddies fall prey to a honey trap. I don't know, you're kind of like this middle-aged, fat, hairy guy. Why did you think when a 30-year-old woman came to your office and wanted you that, you looked like George Clooney and he couldn't resist? This is a corrupt regime, and they have one of the problems with the idea of any sort of anyone rising up, is these competing factions who pull down the other person. We saw Ghalibaf trying to rise up, and the files of his a very little piece of his corruption started coming out, and he got discredited, etc. So I think it's a very, very deadlocked system in many ways, in a desperate situation. And I keep trying to think of all the different scenarios that could happen. How is this system going to react? The early signs, as I said, even the moves that seem so natural, give some false hope. Let Mousavi off a thing. I mean, it's a stretch, but people are desperate and they'll take it. But we're not seeing those, and if we do, this is going to be too little, too late. I don't see this system capable. If we look at, we've seen the issue of water crisis and electricity crisis. This is not new. These warnings have gone on and on and on, but the regime says, okay, let's just muddle through. And I don't think we're in a position to be able to muddle through. And that the decision making, from what I saw, is very, very deadlocked and very paralyzed. So it's going to be difficult to predict the outcome of that. Now we have another issue, which is infiltration. So even those people who are making recommendations, now put yourself in Khamenei's position as well, not just Khamenei, but even going down the brass, they don't know if they're giving a recommendation to someone, is that person an infiltrator? It's very difficult. Maybe I should tell you how some of these things work, because I've spent some time with people who ended up in prison who were kind of duped by the Israelis. To give you an idea of how this works, the general ward of Evin prison is not, or was not, I mean, it's been bombed. You didn't see a lot of like gangster mob looking like people. You had some different characters, but you didn't see anyone that if you saw them on the street, we would cross the street and walk on the other side's sidewalk. But one day, indeed, there were 3 guys that shaven heads, tattoos from head to toe, and said, "Oh my God, who are these folks?" We have a strange line of profession in Iran called sharkhar. Basically, I don't know how to translate that, but tough guys that you hire when someone owes you money, because the banking system there is anyway. So these tough guys go and I say like, Arash, I'm sorry, you're in front of me in the monitor, so I'll pick on you. Say like, Arash owes me money. I hire this guy, and he goes and sits in his office and convinces him that it's best to settle that debt rather quickly. So how these guys were there, we went and looked at their files and found out that they're security or political prisoners. Like, what? It turned out that some businessman came to them and said, "Hey, how would you like to make a quick $10,000?" And 10,000 was a huge, in dollars, amount for them. So what do I have to do? And they said, well, this guy, again, let's pick on Arash hasn't paid me. This is beyond trying to settle it. He's got this workshop a little out of town. I want you just to go and break it. I'm fed up with this guy. $10,000, go in there and break everything. Sounds like easy money. So they show up. There's just one old guard, and they tell him, "Look, you're a poor guy like us. Just shut up." And the guard kept trying to explain, "This is a really bad idea. Guys, let us explain." They said, no, this is best for you. They tape his mouth and tape him to say, so you're absolved of any responsibility. One guard. They go in there and this place looks very strange. They break everything up. And within 10 minutes, they see dozens of armed guys above their head saying, "Lie down." It was the Ministry of Intelligence above them. They had just gone and broken a clandestine nuclear research facility. So, I mean, this is the kind of system, this is how incompetent it is. I mean, forget how easy it was to infiltrate, but you have some secret thing that you have one old guy guarding it. it's the same within some of the decisions made. If you look at it, the only likely explanation is, well, it's two things. It's very hard to distinguish what decision was made because of infiltration, what decision was made because they're highly, highly, highly incompetent people who are appointed yes men who have absolutely no idea what they're doing. I'll leave the comments at that.
Thank you, Siamak. You raised a lot of important issues. We have about 24 minutes or so left. I'm sure we'll come back to it, but let me turn to you, Holly. Number of questions, are asking about the role of the opposition diaspora. Could you share with us what you see in terms of the reception to someone like Reza Pahlavi in Iranian society, in Iran, the role he could play, how his image has been impacted by this war? You're talking about, number of you were talking about Khamenei being absent for weeks. So there's this power vacuum at the top. So there's this issue of leadership at this moment of crisis in many ways. And also questions that are coming in. And this is something I'm sure we all saw early on in the war, the regime's desire to suddenly speak in terms of Iran, the country, and park Islam, the religion, the foundation of this regime, kind of park it away, knowing that political Islam has very few friends, if you will, in Iranian society. So how did that dynamic play out? I mean, I remember writing about this, saying, it's kind of too late, too little, too late, and it's not going to be taken seriously. Nobody's going to look at Ali Khamenei as the Iranian nationalist or this regime as a nationalist entity, and yet this is the game they want to play. How have you seen that effort by the regime sort of work so far in terms of linking up to pre-Islamic Iran, trying to mobilize Iranian society around the flag, if you will?
Lots of questions to answer. I'm going to start with your last one since I prepared a slide for it, and I did see a lot of comments about some of the imagery used, which I actually happen to have. So
Great.
So I want to talk about Iranian nationalism that we've been seeing. So I think Siamak and maybe even Arash hinted about this in some of their conversations, that Iranians during the war were coming together and rallying around the flag of nationalism, but not in the sense that the Islamic Republic has been selling, which is rallying around the Islamic Republic. I think it's more that they've had a shared experience of war and witnessing it, whether they were impacted by living just doors down from one of those buildings. I was informed that an apartment I lived in Tehran was 3 doors down from one of those officials and by a friend. And so just to give you a sense of how deeply embedded these regime officials were living amongst Iranian society, but also just when you look at what was happening in Tehran specifically, not one part of a compass was untouched in Tehran. So whether you're living near the explosions that were happening or you were seeing them from your window, everyone was impacted more or less in Tehran. And so they were having to pick up the pieces together and had lived this together as a society in the capital specifically. And so the regime, I'm sorry about that, something dropped. The regime itself has recognized, as we noted, that that there's a big anti-regime sentiment. We talked about the 70–80%. I think I'm going to pinpoint to a specific academic in Iran, Nasser Hadian. He was actually quoted in a piece by Robin Wright in The New Yorker as saying 80% of the population despises this regime. So this is actually a number from someone based in Iran. And it really very much checks the box with a lot of us. So it's not just us in the West saying this. This is actually Iran-based academics talking like this as well. So during the war, the regime quickly realized, okay, it has a problem on its hands. People are celebrating this, at least initially. We need to turn this on its head and kind of, I would say, tear at the heartstrings of the Iranian people. So they decided they're going to tap into ancient Persia and Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, which is Iran's, I would say, likened to the Epic of Homer. And so during the war, state media, for example, we had this picture here of a state media panel, and it says Baroye Iran, and it's for the sake of Iran. And actually, that's a reference to Iran-based singer Shervina Hajipour's song Baroye, which won a Grammy, and it became the de facto protest anthem during Women Like Freedom. And you can see that they have an Iranian shoulder, an Islamic Republic flag, ballistic missile, drone, and then you have this Achaemenid ancient Persian relief that you've popularly seen in Persepolis holding this Islamic Republic flag. So that's one of the examples. And during the war throughout, we started seeing all of a sudden these billboards pop up, and even President Masoud Pezeshkian tweet a picture of Arash Kamun, or Arash the Archer, which is this mythological figure. But in the billboard you see below, it's actually he's firing ballistic missiles or rockets. And when the ceasefire happened, it was interesting to see Khamenei's speech. He actually said Dorud, which is like a Persian way of saying hello. And so he did that. And he also emphasized in his speech, he said, Iran possesses an ancient civilization. Our cultural and civilizational wealth is hundreds of times greater than that of the US. So here is the Supreme Leader himself talking about this ancient culture and history that Iran has. And if for those that don't have Iranian friends, Iranians are inherently nationalistic. So this is something that it has always existed. Again, referencing journalist Robin Wright, I think she described it really well when she said that you take a Texan and add 5,000 years of history and you get an Iranian. And so just to see, like, this was the kind of sentiment the regime was trying to curate. And it was also interesting when the ceasefire happened, we saw these really surprising videos, first in Azadi or Freedom Square, of the Tehran Orchestra playing A Iran or O Iran, which is the pre-revolution anthem. And then we saw another variation of it outside of state media where the Israelis had attacked during the war. And I'll play you a little clip of that because they also weaved in one of the little girls that was killed in one of the airstrikes. And she also is singing this video. So I'll play that for you just to give you a visual of what that was like. And so, I mean, for me, just seeing this blown out building, like there's a real deep propaganda value there of playing this nationalistic song in front of this blown out building, and of course in front of Azadi Square, which has been the center point, the epicenter of so many protests, including the revolution itself. And famously, there was 1 million protesters during the 2009 post-election protests known as the Green Movement. So they're really were tying into that. And then after the war, we started seeing these reference to, first we had the Achaemenid dynasty or Haqomenshi dynasty, and then we started seeing the Sasanian dynasty reference, which was another ancient Persian dynasty. And we started seeing these pictures of Shapur the First, which you see down here, and it says Iranian Sarbazanai Iran, and it's saying that you're like Shapur. And I don't want to give a long ancient Persian history lesson, but basically, Shapur won a war against the Romans, and there's this famous relief, Nakhsh Rostam, which is actually featured up here, and you might not be able to tell, but that's Shapur the First, and kneeling before him is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And in this relief, which actually exists, by the way, minus the Netanyahu, there's in the original version, it's Roman Emperor Philip the Arab or Philip the First that's kneeling before him and begging for peace. And in this relief or propaganda poster, it says in Hebrew, Google Hebrew, I would assume, kneel before the Iranians, and it says that in English. And on the left side, it's more of a poetic reference. It says, since the dawn of time, it has brought the unmanly to its knees. And so you're seeing a lot of this play out. And so there's also been countless articles about Iranian nationalism and how there's been an emphasis on this, but I really think we need to separate what the regime's version of nationalism is, which is showing this, versus how Iranians feel that. And there was a great quote recently, and someone said, authentic nationalism comes from the streets, from protests, from shared pain, not from government podiums. And this was from an Iranian based in Iran. And then there was a great post on X, and it was from researcher and documentary filmmaker Hossein Debashi. And he said, it is a great mistake if the higher ups think that the empathy and unity of people of Iran against a foreign enemy equates to their satisfaction with the Islamic Republic. So basically, I think the key takeaway about this whole spin on Iranian nationalism is that being anti-war doesn't translate as being pro-regime. So I really want to emphasize on that. What you're seeing here is not how Iranians are feeling. They definitely don't want their country invaded and for bombs to destroy their country. And they are a proud people with a deep sense of culture and history, but this sense of what the regime is putting out and saying that Iranians are rallying around the flag and supporting them, at least the anti-war, I'm sorry, anti-regime cohort, do not feel this way. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Holly. That was great. Thank you. Listen, we have about 10 minutes or so. Arash gets my next question. Then I'm hoping we'll have a few minutes for a sort of speedy last round before we wrap up at 11:30. Arash, let me ask you this. We have Ali Khamenei, who's discovered Iranian nationalism in his days of trouble, and then we have Bibi Netanyahu, who keeps telling the Iranian people, "I will take you back to your proud pre-Islamic Iran." So there's a competition going on between the two men. But here, Khamenei, in the midst of all this, is trying sort of, as Siamak was saying, small steps of reform. And we've seen Iranian small steps for the course of 46 years, but they've never been serious, strategic. They've basically essentially been about buying time for a regime. But then you have people like Ali Akbar Velayati, one of the probably closest advisors to Khamenei, who comes out, and again, I don't know if this is sort of a ploy, but he came out recently and said, we have to stop our outdated methods. And anybody can go watch videos from Tehran on YouTube showing that the mandatory veil seems to be gone. Reports in diaspora media that now alcohol consumption is not something the regime has the resources to go after anymore. So this is a regime that really has to pick today its fights much more carefully than it has done in the past. And the question to you, Arash, is given the sort of internal pressures and external pressures, could Khamenei find himself in a situation where some of these small steps reforms that are supposed to buy him time will get out of hand and actually end up being bigger than he had bargained for?
So, this is a great conversation about the future. I already really think in terms of post-Khamenei era, because I think he's been sidelined a little, and he's 86. I mean, so, and he does not, look, the key issue is this. In the year 2019, 40th anniversary, he gave this important speech, and he said, we need to build this next generation of revolution. They need to be devout, young revolutionaries. He's failed. It doesn't exist. It's not that they don't exist, they're there, but they're kind of losers. They're not the sort of people who can lead a country like Iran. They're like, weirdos like Saeed Jalili and them. I mean, these guys will not win in internal power struggles. That's just my view. People like Siamak who spend a lot of time, with these guys, some of these guys sort of in prison and outside. I'm sure you've sort of seen them. We've interacted with them. I mean, the other guys, like maybe not so much people like Jalili, but some of the other factions, whatever you say about them, they're not going to lose to people like Jalili, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean that's sort of what I think. Okay, so if they're not gonna lose, if these guys, like the continuity guys, the ones who really want, they want what is they want an Islamic Republic that brings sort of Puritan Islamic society in Iran and puts up the flag of fighting US and Israel to the teeth forever. This is sort of continuity, guys. What would it look like? It would be if Khamenei died and let's say Mir Bagheri became the next supreme leader. I just don't see that happening. The other factions of the regime do want fundamentally different things. So no, I don't think the reform in Iran has been just a matter of buying time. I think like Khatami and them, like they're genuinely liberal Democrats. Now they weren't liberal Democrats, and they didn't want Iran to become France, but they really had some vision. This is a long conversation, right? But they had some vision that 1979 was not supposed to end in this. It was supposed to end into something else. And if you look at their track record, look at the kind of attempts they tried to do, it was clear that it was sort of very significant changes. I mean, after all, they want free elections for the parliament, right? I mean, that's sort of they openly wanted that. They wanted the supreme leader to become a figurehead. I mean, they already wanted that in late 1990s. So I think it's important. It's not that's the sort of history of internal factions in the Islamic Republic. Now, okay, so when it comes to the future, I think velayati that you mentioned, that's sort of important to it. We can talk about what Larijani said here and there. We can talk about these little signs, and we're having this debate on July 30th, and we all remember the latest thing. I mean, if we had it like 2 weeks later before that, we had another thing. There are all these little signs always. Um, I think what it boils down to is there are some like Tajzada and others who genuinely want a democracy in Iran. They want to democratize Iran. They believe Khomeinism has failed. They want Iran to they want Iran to be a country in which people elect their leaders. They're Democrats. They're really, in fact, read books like Laura Sekul's Children of Paradise. They're a kind of almost stereotypical liberal Democrats who like read like all the main liberal thinkers, and they like Iranian Democrats are really Iranian Democrats and liberals are really something in this way. So I mean, they're there and they'll fight for their demands and they'll have support of civil society. I'm not I don't think in the immediate sense they're the first candidate to succeed. But then comes other folks like Velayati. Like I love Siamak's points about internal points at the IRGC. It always gets me when people talk about IRGC as like one faction. As in, and usually a hardline faction. It's just not true. IRGC itself is driven with all these different factions exist inside the IRGC in all levels, as Siamak explained. So the Democratic faction, as I said, the sort of pro-democracy faction doesn't have very high chances, although I think it will be a factor in the situation and it will fight, and it deserves support, obviously. But other factions, folks like Velayati, folks like Larijani, folks like Rouhani, what they realize, folks like Akhundi, read the letters by the Economist, led by Akhundi. These are very serious people, and their point is, look, Iran needs to grow its GDP and needs to be a power and needs to, they think so. When we've got patriotism, it's not just like, patriotism is a very important framework because it's what brings all of us together, and truly all of us, from the opposition to Iranians. It's not just some empty debate about, oh, how much like we care about which symbols and all that. Is that, we all have a framework of Iran. I mean, a lot of people have a framework of Iran. Um, a lot of people, including those in the regime, they like to think of themselves as Iranian in some levels, right? Like I'm sure Akhundi likes to think of himself as Rose Minister of Iran, not Rose Minister of the Islamic Republic. Ali Majidi, that you mentioned, you read this guy's interviews, you can't just fake it for this long. He clearly thinks of himself as an Iranian diplomat, in the tradition of Iranian diplomats before 1979. Another point that is interesting, Holly talked about the glorification of the pre-Islamic Iran. One interesting thing is glorification of Pahlavi Iran by different parts of Islamic Republic. It's absolutely astounding. In fact, when they attack Reza Pahlavi, their attacks is that you are ashamed to your father, who was a true patriot, right? A lot of his opponents are saying that, including those in the regime. It's really some sort of ideological defeat for the Islamic Republic to resort to praising some parts of the Pahlavi in order to attack the son. And I think the reason for that is not Pahlavi himself, it's this Iranian framework. Okay, so where does this bring me to end? These folks like, you mentioned Larijani, Velayati, Akhundi, they represent different shades of different things. Someone like Velayati who served the regime for so many years, was foreign minister for 16 years, he has like 30 jobs, really core regime. And he's the head of like 20 hospitals and like head of like some Palestine journal on the side, really insider figure. What does it mean when he says something like that? I think they realize that they realize that the policies of repression of people and sort of this puritanism in Iranian society has failed. That's sort of my last point. That the 2 points that I identified, right? The sort of puritanism in Iranian society, i.e., a repressive Islamist society, and a foreign policy that is based on fighting West and Israel, they need to go. I think a huge sections of the Islamic Republic have understood that this needs to go on sort of pragmatic grounds. So post Khamenei era, I think we will see that shift. I think
Right.
we will see that shift. I think they'll bring these shifts around. The question is, of course, then, what will people's reaction be to that? Will people accept it, or will we see it as opening? Will the Democratic factions that I talked about, both inside and sort of outside regime, will they push more? All of this is an open chess. But I think there will be significant changes pushed by this kind of centrist factions post Khamenei, and I think the continuity candidates will lose in this power struggle. If this is like the KGB coup of August 1991 in Soviet Union, as President Ahmadinejad also recently said,
Right.
they'll fail. They'll have
Right.
nowhere to go. This regime would not continue as it is.
Thank you, Arash. I had so many more questions that I wanted to get to. One of them actually was on this issue of this strategic loneliness that this regime has created for itself is not limited just to the domestic situation. Nobody was there really, from Russia to China to anyone really significant in the Arab Islamic world, to come to its aid. Iran was alone during this 12-day war. And that, to me, that there's so many lessons to be learned, but I wonder if they have. But at the same time, the Russias and the Chinas of this world do not want to see Iran change in a big way, because that's not in their geopolitical interest, as we know. But listen, unless you have any of you have anything that you want to put in for the next sort of 10, 15, 20 seconds that we have, if you don't, I just want to thank you for your insights. I think the three of you today have unpacked so much in terms of basic domestic realities that are happening, a part of life in the Islamic Republic on the other side of the world, that many Americans that make up most of our audience might not know as well as they should, perhaps, given how big of a challenge Iran is for American policymakers going forward. So, I learned a lot from you. I want to thank you for your time, for your insights, and I would say any analyst out there, if you had to pick a country to follow, monitor going forward, Iran would be a good candidate, because so much is at stake, both domestically in terms of what happens in Iran, and obviously the ramifications of change in Iran for the rest of the Middle East and US policy linked to that. So anyway, I want to thank you again, Siamak, Holly, Arash. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your insights, joining us. This video will be available on at the website of Middle East Institute, so people can refer to it. Do share as you see fit. And again, have a great day, and until next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.